In the days when Gilgalad yet held sway in Lindon, and the shadow of Sauron had not yet fallen heavy upon the lands of Middle-earth, there dwelt in the uttermost peaks of the misty mountain a being of such ancient lineage that even the Eldar spoke of him only in whispered tale. Khazad-Gash was his name in the tongue of the dwarf, though they knew him not, and in the common speech he might be called Stonebeard, the Eternal. He was the last of the Onodrim stone, the stone Ents, kindred to those tree shepherds of Fangorn, yet fashioned from the very bones of the mountains themselves. For nigh on 3,000 years had Stonebeard slumbered in the high places, his mighty form become one with the crags and peaks, moss and lichen clothing his shoulders like a mantle of green and gray. His breath was the mountain wind, his heartbeat the grinding of stone upon stone in the deep places of the earth. Yet on this day, as the sun's first light touched the snow-crowned summit of Caradhras, something stirred in the ancient depths of his being. The awakening came not as a gentle dawn, but as a tremor that shook the very foundations of the mountain. Birds took flight from their roosts, and the few hardy mountain goats that dwelt in those heights bleated in terror as they felt the earth itself groan beneath them. Far below, in the hidden valley of Rivendell, even Lord Elrond paused in his writing, sensing some great change in the harmony of the world. Stonebeard's eyes opened for the first time in an age, great orbs of crystalline blue, like frozen waterfalls caught in eternal ice. His voice, when at last it came, was the sound of avalanches and rock falls, of ancient glaciers grinding their way through stone valleys. "Too long," he rumbled, each word causing small stones to tumble from the mountainside. "Too long have I held my vigil, while the world below changes and shifts like sand in the wind. The song of my brethren grows faint, and I fear I am alone." He raised himself then, stone sinews cracking like thunder, sending cascades of snow and rock tumbling into the valleys below. His form was mighty beyond the telling, taller than the trees of Fangorn, broader than the gates of Moria. His skin was the gray granite of the mountain's heart. His hair and beard the silver white of glacial ice, shot through with veins of precious minerals that caught and held the morning light. As he stood to his full height, his head crowned with clouds, Stonebeard gazed out across the vast expanse of Middle-earth spread before him. To the east lay the brown lands of Rhovanion, to the west the green country of Eriador. South stretched the white peaks of his mountain home, and north lay darkness, a shadow upon the land that had not been there when last he walked. "What evil is this that stains the northern reaches?" he wondered aloud, his voice echoing from peak to peak. The very stone cries out in anguish, and the mountains themselves seem to weep tears of ice and shadow. It was then that he heard it, faint as the whisper of wind through stone, yet unmistakable to his ancient ears, a voice calling across the vast distances, weak with age and sorrow. Another of his kind lived still, imprisoned, crying out in pain and desperation. "Khazad-i-Menu," came the distant call. "The dwarves come not to our aid, and the darkness grows ever stronger. Brother, if any of our people yet live, come to the Grey Mountain, for I am held fast, and cannot break free." Stonebeard's great hands clenched into fists, causing small avalanches on the slopes below. His people, for so long, he had believed himself the last of his line, the final guardian of the ancient ways. Yet here was proof that at least one other of the stone Ents survived, trapped somewhere in the northern waste. "Hold fast, brother mine," he called back, his voice carrying across the leagues like the roar of a great storm. "I come, though all the armies of darkness stand in my path. The stone shepherds shall not fade from this world, while strength remains in these old bones." And so began the great journey of Stonebeard, the Eternal, last guardian of the misty mountains, as he stepped down from his high throne and set forth into a world grown strange and perilous in his long sleep. Each step shook the earth. Each movement was like the passage of time itself made visible. The mountains seemed to mourn his leaving, for never again would they know the protection of one so ancient and mighty. Behind him he left only silence and the empty throne of stone where he had kept his vigil. Before him lay a path fraught with dangers unknown, leading into the shadow-haunted north, where his kinsmen waited in bonds that even the strength of stone could not easily break. The last of the stone giants had awakened, and Middle-earth would never be the same. 3 days had passed since the Great Awakening, and word of strange happenings in the misty mountains had reached the hidden valley of Rivendell. Traders spoke of avalanches that moved against the wind, of voices like thunder echoing from peak to peak, and of a shadow vast as a mountain itself, seen walking among the high places. Lord Elrond, keeper of Villia and wise in the lore of elder days, knew well what these signs portended. In the Hall of Fire, where the light of the Eldar burned eternal, Elrond sat in council with those few who remained of the White Council. Gandalf the Grey was there, his weathered face grave with concern, and beside him sat Glorfindel, chief of the Eldar in Rivendell, his golden hair bright even in the firelight. Círdan the shipwright had come from the Grey Haven, bearing news from the western shores, and even Radagast the Brown had emerged from his wanderings in the wild. The time of the Stone Shepherds was ancient, even when Gil-galad ruled in Lindon, spoke Elrond, his ageless voice heavy with memory. I knew them of old, in the days when the mountains were young, and the world was green. They were mighty beings, older than the Ents of Fangorn, fashioned by Aula himself in the music of creation, to be guardians of the deep places and high peaks. Gandalf leaned forward upon his staff, his gray eyes troubled. Yet if one walks abroad again after so long a sleep, it bodes ill. The Stone Ents did not lightly abandon their vigil. What power could wake them from their long rest? The same power that stirs in the north, replied Círdan grimly. My people bring word from the gray shores. The very sea speaks of shadows moving in the uttermost wastes, of ancient evils long thought, buried stirring once more beneath the ice and stone. Radagast, who had sat silent throughout the discourse, now spoke in his rough voice. The beasts of the wild are fleeing southward. Great eagles speak of a darkness that devours light itself, spreading like a plague across the gray mountains. If one of the Onodrim stone walks abroad, it is because his brother lies in peril. His brother? Elrond's eyes sharpened with sudden understanding. Speak you of Khazad-Uzbad, the crown of stone, who kept watch over the northern reaches? I had thought him passed into legend with all his kin. Legend, perhaps, to the young folk, said Gandalf. But you and I remember the days when the Stone Shepherds walked openly in Middle-earth. Khazad-Uzbad was mightiest of his kind save one, Khazad-Gash of the Misty Mountain, whom the dwarves name Stonebeard in their tongue. Glorfindel, who had remained silent, now rose from his seat. Then it is Stonebeard who walks abroad, seeking his kinsmen in the north. But what enemy could bind one of the Stone Ents? They were wrought to endure until the breaking of the world. A shadow seemed to pass over Elrond's face. There are powers in the northern waste older than Sauron, though less in malice. The cold drakes of the Grey Mountains are ancient beyond reckoning, and their hatred of the Onodrim stone goes back to the elder days. If one of them has awakened. Scatha, whispered Círdan, and the very name seemed to chill the air in the hall. The great cold drake, last of the fire dragon's elder brothers. I had hoped the tales were but legend. No legend, said Gandalf gravely. In the deep archives of Minas Tirith, I have read the accounts of the Northmen. Scatha the Worm has slept beneath the Grey Mountains for nigh on 2,000 years, but his sleep grows ever lighter. If he has awakened and bound Khazad-Uzbad in chains of ice and malice, then Stonebeard walks into a trap, finished Elrond. We must send word, warn him of the peril that awaits. Warn him? Radagast laughed, though there was no mirth in it. You might as well warn the mountain storm or counsel the avalanche. The Stone Shepherds know not fear, and they remember every injury done to their kind since the world began. If his brother calls, Stonebeard will answer, though all the dragons of the north bar his path. The council sat in heavy silence, contemplating the magnitude of what was to come. In the north, ancient powers stirred that had slept since the elder days, and between them stood one lone figure, the last free child of the mountains, walking into peril beyond imagining for love of his kinsman. "What would you have us do?" asked Glorfindel at last. "The might of Rivendell is not what it was in Gil-galad's day, and even at our full strength, we could not stand against the great cold drake." Elrond was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he gazed into the fire. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy. "We can do little but hope, and remember. The stone shepherds are proud, and they have ever walked alone. Yet, perhaps this time, their greatest strength shall prove also their greatest weakness." "What mean you by this?" asked Gandalf. "Only this," replied Elrond. "In all the long years of the world, never has there been recorded an alliance between the fire of the mountains and the ice of the ancient drakes. Yet now, in these latter days, such strange alliances may be forged. The enemy of my enemy, as men say, may prove friend indeed." Outside the hall, the night wind bore strange tidings from the north, the sound of footsteps, heavy as landslides, growing ever more distant as they turned toward the gray mountain and whatever fate awaited there. 7 days had Stonebeard journeyed from his mountain throne, and with each step the world grew stranger beneath his feet. Gone were the familiar paths of his youth, when the stone shepherds walked freely between the peaks and valleys. Where once green meadows had laughed in the morning sun, now lay barren reaches scored by the passage of armies. Where crystal streams had sung their way to the sea, now ran waters dark with the memory of bloodshed and war. The great stone ent paused upon a ridge that overlooked the Bruinen, the river that guarded the approaches to Rivendell. Below him, the waters ran clear and swift, bearing the blessing of Elrond's power. Yet even here he could sense the shadow that crept ever southward from the gray mountains. His brother's call came fainter now, weakened by distance and despair. Yet still it drew him onward like a lodestone draws iron. "Strange," he rumbled to himself, his voice causing small stones to shift and tumble down the slope. "In the days of my youth, this land rang with the laughter of the Eldar and the songs of running water. Now it holds its breath, as if waiting for some doom to fall." As he stood thus in contemplation, there came a sound upon the wind, not the cry of his imprisoned brother, but something else, the beat of great wings and the whistle of air parted by forms vast and swift. Stonebeard raised his crystalline eyes to the sky and beheld a sight both wondrous and troubling. 3 of the great eagles descended from the heights, their wingspans broader than the sails of the ships of Númenor in days of old. Their leader, a mighty bird whose feathers shone like burnished gold in the setting sun, alighted upon a crag not far from where the stone ent stood. Lesser folk would have fled in terror from such a present, but Stonebeard had walked with the eagles in the days when the world was young. "Gwaihir, the Wind Lord greets thee, Khazad-Gash of the mountains," spoke the great eagle, his voice like the rush of wind through high passes. "Long has it been since last the stone shepherds walked openly in Middle-earth." "Too long, friend of the heights," replied Stonebeard, inclining his massive head in greeting. "Yet need drives me from my vigil, for my brother calls from the north, and his voice grows ever weaker." Gwaihir's golden eyes grew troubled. "Aye, we have heard that call, carried on winds that freeze the very air through which they blow. But know this, Ancient One, the path you would walk leads into peril beyond imagining. Scatha, the cold drake, has awakened from his long sleep, and his malice fills the gray mountains like a poisonous mist." Scatha! The name was torn from Stonebeard's throat like the grinding of glaciers. Long have I waited for the chance to settle that ancient debt. In the elder days, he slew many of my kindred, thinking himself mighty because he commanded ice and ancient malice. "Be not so swift to welcome battle, old friend," cautioned Gwaihir. "The great cold drake is not as he was in the days of his youth. Long ages of sleep beneath the ice have changed him, and the darkness that stirs in the north has lent him new, terrible powers. Your brother lies bound not merely by chains of ice, but by sorceries that would make even the Eldar tremble. Stonebeard's great fists clenched, causing the ridge upon which he stood to crack and split. Then all the more reason to make haste. Each day that passes sees Khazad-Uzbad grow weaker, and if Skatha means to devour him, as he did our brothers of old, that is the strangest part of this tale, interrupted one of Gwaihir's companions, a fierce-eyed eagle whose voice was like the cry of wind-torn stone. The cold drake does not seek to devour your brother, but to bind him to his will. We have seen from the high places great workings of ice and shadow in the heart of the Grey Mountain, as if some vast construction rises there. This news gave Stonebeard pause. In all the long histories of the world, never had dragon and stone ent been anything but mortal enemies. What purpose could Skatha have in keeping his brother alive, save to make his suffering the greater? What manner of construction? He asked, though he feared the answer. Gwaihir was silent for a long moment, his keen eyes distant with memory. A tower, ancient one, a tower of ice and darkness that reaches toward the very sky, and at its heart, pulses a light that is not light, cold as the void between the stars. The words struck Stonebeard like physical blows. A tower, and in the north, where the ancient powers slept. Could it be that Skatha sought to raise some weapon from the elder days, some remnant of the first wars when the world was young? I must go, he said simply. Brother calls to brother, and I will not leave him to face this doom alone. Then go with our blessing, said Gwaihir, spreading his great wings. Yet know this, you need not walk alone into the shadow. The eagles of the Misty Mountains remember the friendship of your people, and we have not forgotten the debts of old. I would not ask others to share in what may be my doom, replied Stonebeard. You do not ask, said the Wind Lord, with something that might have been amusement in his fierce voice. We offer freely as friends of old should. The sky roads know no barriers of stone or ice, and our eyes see far. You shall have scouts upon your journey, and when the time comes for battle, you shall not stand alone. With that, the three great eagles took to the air, their wings bearing them swiftly northward. But Stonebeard did not immediately resume his journey. Instead, he stood long in thought upon the ridge, watching the stars come out one by one in the darkening sky. The news the eagles brought had changed much. No longer was this merely a rescue of his brother. It seemed some greater evil was afoot, some plan of Skatha's that required the strength and wisdom of the stone shepherd to complete. What web is this that you weave, ancient worm? He murmured to the northern wind. And what part would you have my brother play in your design? But the wind brought no answer, only the distant cry of his kinsman, fainter now than ever before. With a sound like the shifting of mountains, Stonebeard resumed his journey north, each step carrying him closer to a confrontation that would shake the very foundation of the world. Behind him, the lights of Rivendell twinkled like fallen stars in the gathering dusk, perhaps the last friendly lights he would see on his journey into the shadow of the north. 10 days more had passed since Stonebeard's meeting with the eagle, and now the stone ent stood upon the borders of a land transformed by malice and ancient power. Before him stretched the Grey Mountain, but not as they had been in the days of his youth. Where once proud peaks had reached toward the sky like the spears of mighty kings, now twisted spires of black ice pierced the clouds, weeping frozen tears that never reached the earth below. The very air was chained, thin and bitter, carrying upon it the taste of metal and old sorrow. No bird sang in this desolation, no beast walked the frozen wastes. Even the hardy mountain pines that had once clothed the lower slopes lay dead and shattered, their wood turned to crystal by some unnatural frost that knew neither season nor mercy. Stonebeard paused at the edge of this wasteland, his crystalline eyes surveying the ruin that stretched before him. In all his long years, through all the changes that had come upon Middle-earth, He had never beheld desolation so complete. It was as if life itself had been drained from the land, leaving only a hollow mockery of what had once been fair. "Brother!" he called out, his voice rolling across the empty valleys like thunder. "I am come at last to the borders of your prison. Hold fast, for your freedom draws near." The answer came not in words, but in a sound that chilled even the ancient heart of the stone ent, a roar of such malice and power that the very mountains seemed to tremble. From the heart of the desolation rose a tower of black ice, impossibly tall and twisted, and around its summit coiled a shape that blocked out the stars. Scatha the cold drake had awakened indeed, and his fury at this intrusion shook the foundations of the world. "Come then, little pebble," the dragon's voice hissed across the wastes, each word a blade of ice that cut the very air. "Come and join your brother in his chains. Long have I waited for both the stone shepherds to walk into my web." But Stonebeard did not answer with words. Instead, he stepped forward into the desolation, and with each step, his form seemed to grow larger, more solid, more terrible in its ancient majesty. His breath came forth as clouds of steam in the frigid air, and where his feet touched the frozen ground, small flowers of stone and crystal bloomed, defying the cold with their beauty. The first league of his journey through the wasteland passed in eerie silence. Nothing moved, save the bitter wind that howled between the ice-sheathed peaks. But as he drew closer to the tower's base, Stonebeard began to perceive the true horror of what Scatha had wrought. The tower was not built of ice alone, but of ice fused with something else, the bones and sinews of the earth itself, torn from the deep places and twisted into new, terrible forms, and woven throughout the structure, like silver threads in a tapestry of nightmare, were chains of some metal that gleamed with cold fire. At the tower's base, half buried in drifts of snow that never melted, Stonebeard beheld his brother at last. Khazad-Uzbad, the crown of stone, mightiest of the northern stone shepherds, lay bound by chains that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. His great form, once proud as the peaks themselves, was dimmed and cracked, his crystalline eyes clouded with pain and long captivity. "Brother," whispered Stonebeard, the word carried on breath that steamed in the frozen air. "What has he done to you?" Khazad-Uzbad raised his head with infinite effort, and when he spoke, his voice was like the grinding of millstones. He would make of us weapons in his war, the chain. They drink our strength, feed it to his tower. Each day, I grow weaker, and his power grows. War? Stonebeard's voice was like an avalanche beginning. What war speaks the ancient worm of? But before his brother could answer, the great shadow fell across them both. Scatha the cold drake descended from his tower, his massive form blotting out the stars. He was vast beyond the telling, larger than the halls of Khazad-Dûm, his scales the color of old ice shot through with veins of black iron. His eyes burned with a cold fire that was the antithesis of all warmth and life, and from his maw came breath that could freeze the very air into shards of crystal. "The war to end all wars, Stone Shepherd," hissed the dragon, his voice like the cracking of glaciers. "The war to remake this world in my image, where the fire of life shall be extinguished forever, and only the perfect cold of eternal winter shall reign." Stonebeard looked up at his ancient enemy, and in his crystalline eyes burned a light that had not dimmed since the world was young. "You speak of madness, Scatha. Even in the elder days, when your kind was mighty, you never dreamed of such folly." The cold drake's laughter was like the sound of icebergs calving into Arctic seas. "In the elder days I was but a servant, bound by the will of my master. But long ages of sleep have taught me truths that even Morgoth never knew. The world grows weary, Stone Shepherd. The fires of creation burn low, and all things tend toward the peace of eternal cold. I would merely hasten that inevitable end. And my brother? What part has he in this mad design?" Sigurd, Scatha's terrible gaze turned toward the bound form of Khazad-Uzbad, and something that might have been hunger flickered in the depths of his ice-cold eyes. The stone shepherds were wrought by Ole to be eternal, to endure until the breaking of the world. That endurance, that strength, imagine it turned to the service of ending rather than beginnings. Your brother's power feeds my tower, but more than that, his very essence shall be the foundation of my new world. Understanding struck Stonebeard like a physical blow. The tower was not merely a weapon, it was a perversion of the song of creation itself, using the eternal nature of the stone shepherd to weave a new theme into the music of the world, a theme of ending, of cold, of the final silence that comes when all things die. Never, he said, and his voice carried the authority of mountain. I will die before I see my brother made servant to your madness. Die? Skatha's head swayed hypnotically, like a serpent preparing to strike. Oh, you will not die, little stone. You will serve as your brother serves. Already the chains hunger for you. And indeed, Stonebeard could see them. Threads of that same cold metal creeping across the frozen ground toward his feet, moving with a life and purpose all their own. But the stone ent did not flee. Instead, he planted his feet firmly upon the frozen earth and raised his great hands to the sky. I am Khazad Gash, he proclaimed, his voice echoing from peak to peak. I am the son of mountains, child of the deep places where the fires of creation still burn. You may bind my body, ancient worm, but my spirit shall remain free. And in the end, it is spirit that shapes the world. The battle was about to begin, a clash between powers that had walked Middle-earth since its youth, and upon its outcome hung the fate of more than just two ancient beings. The very nature of the world itself lay in the balance. The chains struck like living serpent, wrapping around Stonebeard's ankles with a sound like ringing iron. But where they expected to find purchase in solid stone, they met instead with something altogether unexpected: warmth. For Stonebeard had not merely grown larger in his approach to the tower, he had kindled within himself the deep fires that burned at the heart of all mountains, the flames that Aula had set there at the world's beginning. The metal chains, forged in Skatha's cold malice, screamed as they touched this ancient warmth, their surface beginning to glow red-hot. Impossible, hissed the cold drake, his ice-blue eyes widening in surprise. The chains were wrought to bind the eternal. No power of fire can break what I have made. Your chains were made for stone shepherd, who had forgotten their true nature, replied Stonebeard, taking a deliberate step forward. The chains about his ankles stretched taut, their metal beginning to smoke. But I remember the songs that Aula sang when he shaped us from the living rock. I remember the forge fires of Valinor. With a sound like mountains breaking, Stonebeard pulled against his bonds. The chains held, but their metal began to change, shifting from silver bright to cherry red, then to the white-hot glow of metal at the very edge of melting. Steam rose where they touched the frozen ground, and for the first time in an age, water ran liquid in the desolation of the gray mountain. Skatha reared back, his massive form coiling in preparation for assault. If you will not be bound willingly, then I shall freeze the very fire in your vein. His jaws gaped wide, and from his throat came not flame, but its opposite, a blast of cold so intense that it turned the very air to crystal. The breath of the cold drake struck Stonebeard full in the chest, and ice began to form across his granite skin. But the stone ent did not fall. Instead, he drew himself up to his full height and opened his own mouth, releasing a sound that was part roar, part song. The ancient melody that mountains sing when they are born from the earth's fire. Where the song touched the ice upon his body, it shattered and fell away like broken glass. Where it reached the chains that bound him, the metal began to bend and warp. And where it struck the base of Skatha's tower, great cracks appeared in the ice-wrought structure. You forget yourself, worm, Stonebeard said, his voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to come from the very bedrock beneath them. You were made for destruction, but we were made for creation. In this contest, creation must always triumph. But even as he spoke, Stonebeard felt the chains tightening around his limbs. Though heated to near melting by his inner fire, they did not break. Indeed, they seemed to draw strength from his very resistance, growing thicker and more numerous with each passing moment. It was then that Khazad-Uzbad, the crown of stone, raised his voice for the first time since his brother's arrival. Weak as he was from long captivity, he yet remembered the songs of the deep places. "Brother," he called, his voice like distant thunder. "The chains, they are not truly metal. They are crystallized malice, frozen hatred given form. Fire alone cannot break them." Understanding dawned in Stonebeard's crystalline eyes. The chains were not forged in any earthly furnace, but woven from the very essence of Skatha's hatred. Millennia of malice and spite made manifest. To break them would require more than fire or strength. It would require something the cold drake had long forgotten existed. "Then let us remind him," Stonebeard said softly, and his voice carried now a new quality, not the rage of mountains or the heat of forge fires, but something infinitely more dangerous to the servants of darkness. Hope, as Stonebeard began to sing, not the songs of creation or destruction, but the simple melody stone shepherds had sung to comfort each other in the long loneliness of their vigil. The chains about his limbs began to tremble, for hope is the one thing that malice cannot endure, and love the one force that hatred cannot overcome. The sound seemed to pain Skatha more than any blow. The great drake writhed and hissed, his coils lashing against the base of his tower. "Silence!" he roared. "I will not hear those cursed songs again!" But it was too late. Khazad-Uzbad had taken up the melody, his voice growing stronger as he remembered who and what he was. The chains that bound him began to crack, hairline fractures spreading along their length like lightning frozen in time. And in the air above them, 3 shadows passed across the face of the moon. Gwaihir the Wind Lord had come at last, and with him his kindred, their great wings bearing them through the bitter air of the gray mountains. The eagle's cries joined the song of the stone shepherds, adding to it the wild freedom of the high places and the unconquerable spirit of the sky. "No!" Skatha's voice was a shriek of pure rage. "I will not be denied. If I cannot bind you, then I shall drag you down with me into the darkness." The cold drake's massive form began to glow with an inner light, not the warm light of fire or sun, but the cold radiance of dying stars. Around the base of his tower, the ice began to crack and shift, and from the fissures rose a sound like the world's ending. For Skatha had made his choice. If he could not remake the world in his image, then he would pull it down into ruin. The tower of ice and bone began to collapse, but its fall was not random. It was directed, aimed like a spear at the heart of Middle-earth itself. The final confrontation had begun, and its outcome would determine whether the darkness of the Grey Mountains would spread across the world, or whether the light of creation would shine once more in the desolate places. The collapse of Skatha's tower was not like the falling of any earthly structure. Built as it was from ice, bone, and crystallized malice, its destruction released forces that had been bound within its walls for uncounted years. Waves of bitter cold rolled outward from the cracking spire, carrying with them the screams of those who had died to provide the tower's foundation. Yet even as the dark edifice crumbled, Stonebeard could see that its fall was controlled, directed by Skatha's will toward some greater purpose. The massive chunks of ice and bone that broke away from the tower's sides did not scatter randomly, but flew like arrows toward specific targets, toward the high passes that led south from the Grey Mountain, toward the valleys where rivers ran down to the sea, toward the ancient roads that connected the realms of the free peoples. "He means to dam the passages," Stonebeard realized with growing horror, "to seal the mountain roads and trap the cold within the Grey Mountains until it spreads beyond all hope of containment." Khazad-Uzbad, his strength returning as the chains that bound him grew weaker, saw the same terrible design. "Not just trap the cold, brother. See how the ice falls. It shapes a pattern, a design." He would turn the very mountains into a great spell circle, with himself at the center. Indeed, as more of the tower collapsed, the fragments formed strange geometric patterns across the desolate landscape. lines of force that pulsed with cold fire, nodes of power where the ice burned with its own malevolent light, and at the center of it all, Skatha himself began to change. The cold drake's massive form was becoming translucent, as if he were transforming from flesh and scale into living ice. His eyes, once burning with cold fire, now glowed with the pale light of distant stars, and his voice, when he spoke again, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You understand too late, stone shepherds," the transformed dragon hissed. "This tower was never my true work. It was merely the focus for something far greater. I have made myself one with the eternal cold, and now I shall spread that gift to all the world." The pattern of ice fragments pulsed, and waves of killing frost spread outward like ripples on a pond. Where the cold touched, the very air crystallized and fell to earth in tinkling shards. The few hardy plants that had somehow survived in the desolation withered and died, their life force drained away to feed Skatha's growing power. But Stonebeard was no longer merely defending. As the chains about his limbs grew weaker, cracked by the songs of hope and love, he began to move with purpose toward the center of the pattern. Each step sent tremors through the ice beneath his feet, and where he walked, small patches of warmth bloomed in the frozen wasteland. "Brother," called Khazad Uzbad, his own chains now hanging in tatters about his massive frame. "The pattern. We must break the pattern before it completes." "Aye," replied Stonebeard, his voice like the rumble of avalanches. "But not by force alone. See how the fragments are arranged. It is the inverse of the song of creation, a melody of endings written in ice and malice. To break it, we must sing its opposite." Above them, Gwaihir and his kindred wheeled in great circle, their keen eyes marking the placement of each ice fragment, their voices adding to the stone shepherd's song. But even as they sang, the cold was spreading, reaching out with tendrils of killing frost toward the lands beyond the gray mountains. "Sing, yes," hissed Skatha, his form now more spirit than flesh. "Sing your little songs while the world freezes around you. Do you not understand? I am become one with the cold itself. You cannot fight winter, you can only submit to it." It was then that Stonebeard realized the true nature of the trap they faced. Skatha had indeed become something beyond a mere dragon. He had transformed himself into a force of nature, or rather, a force of unnature. Like winter given consciousness and malice, he was now part of the very fabric of the world. But if Skatha could become one with cold and ending, then perhaps the stone shepherds could become one with their own true nature. Not just the strength of stone, but the creative fire that burns at the heart of all mountains. "Brother," Stonebeard called to Khazad Uzbad, "do you remember the first song Aule taught us? The melody of the world's beginning, when all things were possible, and nothing yet was fixed in form?" Understanding dawned in the crown of Stone's crystalline eyes, the song of potential. "But brother, to sing that song fully would require—" "I know what it would require," Stonebeard replied grimly. "The question is whether the world is worth the price." For the song of potential was not merely music. It was the fundamental creative force of the universe, the power by which the music of creation had first shaped reality from the void. To sing it fully would mean opening themselves completely to that power, becoming not just stone shepherds, but active participants in the shaping of the world itself. The risk was enormous. Such power could easily destroy them, burning out their consciousness like candles in a hurricane. But the alternative was to watch as Skatha's cold spread across all Middle-earth, turning the living world into a frozen wasteland where nothing could grow or flourish. "For Middle-earth," said Stonebeard simply, and began to sing. The melody that rose from his granite throat was like nothing heard in the world since its creation. It was the song of stars condensing from cosmic dust, of mountains rising from the sea, of the first green shoots pushing through barren soil toward the light. And as Khazad Uzbad joined his voice to his brothers, the very foundations of reality seemed to tremble. Scatha's ice pattern began to crack and shift, its geometric perfection disrupted by the wild harmonies of creation. The cold drake's form, translucent as it had become, began to waver like heat shimmer, his consciousness struggling to maintain coherence in the face of such primal power. "No!" The dragon's voice was now the sound of ice sheets breaking apart. "I will not be denied. If I cannot have eternal cold, then I shall have eternal war." And with those words, Scatha revealed his final, desperate gambit. For the cold drake had not merely sought to freeze the world, he had sought to trap it in a cycle of endless conflict, where ice and fire would battle for all eternity, neither able to triumph over the other. The true twist in this ancient tale was about to be revealed. As the song of potential reached its crescendo, reality itself began to bend and warp around the singing stone shepherd. The air shimmered with possibility, glimpses of what the world might become if their power ran unchecked. In one moment, the gray mountains bloomed with impossible gardens of crystal and flame. In the next, they melted into seas of liquid starlight that reflected skies that had never been. But even as their song grew in power, Stonebeard felt something wrong in the very fabric of the world around them. The ice pattern was breaking, yes, but not in the way he had expected. Instead of shattering completely, it was reforming, reshaping itself into something new and even more terrible. "Brother!" Khazad-Uzbad's voice carried warning even as he continued to sing. "Look to the pattern. It changes." Indeed, where the geometric lines of ice had been disrupted by their song, new configurations were forming. The fragments of Scatha's tower were rearranging themselves into a vast spiral, with the transformed dragon at its center. But this was not the pattern of eternal cold that Scatha had originally wrought. It was something far more complex and dangerous. Scatha's laughter echoed across the transformed landscape, his voice now seeming to come from the very ice itself. "Did you think me so simple, stone shepherds? The cold was but the first movement of my design. Now comes the second, eternal conflict." The spiral pattern pulsed, and from its nodes rose shapes that chilled even the ancient hearts of the stone shepherd. Creatures of living ice, but not merely frozen water. These were embodiments of conflict itself, shaped to be forever at war with anything that lived and grew. Each one was different, as if crafted to oppose a specific enemy, and their eyes burned with the cold fire of endless hatred. "Behold my true work," Scatha hissed. "Not the ending of all things, but the prevention of all peace. These servants shall spread across Middle-earth, ensuring that every alliance fails, every friendship turns to enmity, every love becomes betrayal. The world shall know nothing but war until the very stars burn out." It was then that Stonebeard understood the full horror of what they faced. Scatha had never truly intended to freeze the world. That had been merely the first step in a far more subtle plan. By creating eternal conflict, he would ensure that the free peoples never again had the chance to unite against darkness. Every alliance would crumble, every hope would turn to ash, and in the end, the world would tear itself apart without any need for dragons or dark lords. But understanding brought with it a new possibility, one that Scatha himself had unwittingly provided. "Brother," Stonebeard said, his voice cutting through the chaos of the spiral's formation. "What if we gave him what he seeks?" Khazad-Uzbad's crystalline eyes widened in shock. "You speak madness. Would you truly doom the world to eternal war?" "Not the world," replied Stonebeard, his voice growing thoughtful even as his song continued to reshape reality around them. "But what if the war he seeks is not the one he expects?" Above them, Gwaihir and his eagles had seen the new threat rising from the spiral pattern. The Wind Lord's voice rang out like a clarion call. "Stone shepherds, the ice spawn rise. They will overrun the passes and spread into the Southlands." But Stonebeard was no longer looking at the ice creatures. His attention was fixed on Scatha himself, on the dragon's transformed state as a being of living cold and conflict. And in that transformed state, he saw something that perhaps even Scatha himself had not noticed. The cold drake was no longer truly a dragon. By becoming one with the forces of cold and conflict, He had made himself into something else entirely. A force of nature, but an unstable one. Like a fire that feeds on itself, he was consuming his own essence to maintain his new form. Given time, he would either burn out completely or transform into something else entirely. Stonebeard murmured, understanding finally dawning. It was the greatest gamble in all the long history of Middle-earth. But if Stonebeard was right, then Scatha's own nature held the key to his defeat. For the cold drake had always been a creature of contradictions. Ice and fire, creation and destruction, ancient wisdom and modern malice. By embracing those contradictions fully, he might be turned from enemy to ally. "Scatha!" Stonebeard called out, his voice now carrying not challenge, but invitation. "You speak of eternal conflict, but what of eternal partnership? You have made yourself into winter, but winter needs summer to give it meaning." The spiral pattern faltered for a moment, as Scatha's attention focused on the stone shepherd. "What trickery is this? You think to deceive me with honeyed words?" "No deception," replied Stonebeard. "Truth. You have spent so long as a creature of destruction that you have forgotten the other half of your nature. But I remember the eldest tale from the days when the world was young. Dragons were not always servants of darkness. They were guardians of the deep knowledge, keepers of the ancient wisdom." "Lies!" Scatha's voice cracked like breaking ice. "We were made to destroy, to hoard, to hate. You were made to endure," Khazad-uzbad said, his voice joining his brother's in this strangest of confrontations. "As we were made to endure. But endurance without purpose becomes stagnation, and stagnation breeds the very malice that now consumes you." The ice creatures that had been rising from the spiral pattern began to waver, their forms becoming less solid as their creator's concentration was disrupted. For the first time in ages, uncertainty flickered in Scatha's cold fire eyes. What would you have of me?" the dragon asked, and his voice held a note that might almost have been hope. It was then that Stonebeard made his final, desperate gambit, an offer that would either save Middle-earth or doom it beyond all redemption. "Join with us," he said simply, "not as master and servant, but as equals. The world has need of winter as well as summer, of endings as well as beginnings. Help us to guard the balance, and your name shall be remembered not as destroyer, but as guardian." The silence that followed this offer seemed to stretch for eternity. The spiral pattern hung frozen in mid-formation, the ice creatures poised between birth and dissolution, and even the bitter wind of the gray mountains seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, the fate of Middle-earth balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the answer of the last cold drake to a proposal that defied every law of dragon and stone shepherd lore. The silence stretched across the desolate peaks, like the moment before an avalanche, when the mountain itself seems to hesitate before deciding whether to stand or fall. Scatha's form wavered between dragon and living winter, his consciousness torn between millennia of hatred and the sudden, impossible prospect of redemption. "Join with you?" The cold drake's voice was barely a whisper now, like wind through ice caves. "Do you know what you ask, Stone Shepherd? I have done things, in the elder days and since, that cannot be undone." Stonebeard's crystalline eyes met those of his ancient enemy, and in them Scatha saw not judgment, but understanding. "We all bear the weight of our choices, Ancient One. The question is not what we have done, but what we choose to do with the time that remains to us." Around them, the ice creatures began to shift and change, their forms reflecting their creator's inner turmoil. Some took on more draconic shapes, while others became more like twisted parodies of stone shepherds, as if Scatha's consciousness was trying to imagine what cooperation might look like. Khazad-uzbad, still weak from his long captivity, but growing stronger with each moment of freedom, stepped forward. His massive form cast a shadow across the spiral pattern, and where his shadow fell, small flowers of stone began to bloom even in the frozen wasteland. "In the days of my imprisonment," the crown of stone said, his voice like distant thunder, "I had long hours to think upon the nature of our ancient enmity. Dragon and stone shepherd have battled since the world was young, But why? What purpose does this conflict serve? Scatha's great head turned toward the bound stone shepherd, and for the first time in ages, curiosity flickered in his ice-cold eyes. "You speak as one who has found answers in his solitude." "Not answers," replied Khazad-Uzbad. "Questions, better questions. We were both made to be eternal, to endure until the ending of the world. But eternity is a long time to spend in hatred, Ancient One. Is there not something better we might do with such a gift?" The spiral pattern pulsed again, but more slowly now, as if responding to the rhythm of a great heart, rather than the chaotic energies of conflict. The ice creatures that had been rising from its nodes began to settle back into the pattern, their forms becoming less distinct, more potential than actual. Above them, Gwaihir and his eagles continued to circle, but their cries had changed from warnings to something that might almost have been encouragement. Even the great wind lord seemed to sense that something unprecedented was happening in the Grey Mountains, a possibility that had never existed before in all the long history of Middle-earth. Scatha was quiet for a long time, his transformed consciousness wrestling with concepts that had been alien to him for millennia. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of weariness that spoke of ages beyond counting. "In the beginning," he said slowly, "I was not always as I am now. There was a time when I guarded the deep places, when my fire kept the shadows at bay, and my wisdom was sought by those who would delve too deep into the earth's secrets. But that was long ago. Not so long that it cannot be remembered," Stonebeard said gently. "Time is a circle, Ancient One, not a line. What was can be again, if we have the courage to choose it." The cold drake's laughter was like the sound of ice beginning to thaw, still harsh, but with an undertone of something that might have been warmth. "Courage? I have been called many things, Stone Shepherd, but never courageous. Dragons are proud, not brave." "Then let this be your first act of courage," Khazad-Uzbad said. "Choose cooperation over conflict. Choose creation over destruction. Choose to be more than the sum of your ancient hatreds." It was then that something extraordinary happened. The spiral pattern, which had been pulsing with the cold light of eternal conflict, began to change. The harsh, geometric lines softened, becoming more organic, more alive. The nodes of power that had been meant to spawn creatures of war instead began to bloom with formations of impossible beauty. Ice flowers that sang with crystalline voices, frost trees whose branches reached toward a sky that seemed suddenly less gray and more silver. Scatha himself was changing too. His translucent form began to solidify, but not into the monstrous shape of a cold drake. Instead, he took on an aspect that was both dragon and something more. A being of winter, yes, but winter as it was meant to be, not as destroyer, but as the necessary rest between seasons, the quiet time that allows for new growth. I had forgotten," the transformed dragon whispered, his voice now carrying harmonic that spoke of deep caves and crystal formation, of the slow patience of geological time and the beauty that comes from ages of careful craftsmanship. "I had forgotten what it was to create rather than destroy." The ice pattern was still spreading outward from the Grey Mountain, but its nature had fundamentally changed. Where once it would have carried killing frost and eternal conflict, now it brought a different kind of cold. The crisp air of winter mornings, the pristine beauty of snow-covered peaks, the promise that after winter comes spring. But even as this transformation began, a new danger made itself known. For the changes in the Grey Mountains had not gone unnoticed by other powers in Middle-earth, and not all of them were pleased by the prospect of ancient enemies becoming allies. From the south came a sound like the trumpeting of great horns, and Stonebeard felt his heart grow heavy with a new understanding. The Valor themselves had taken notice of what was happening in the Grey Mountains, and they were not entirely pleased with this unprecedented alliance. Manwë's voice came on the wind, carrying the authority of the highest of the Valor. "What is this that you do, children of Ole? The patterns of the world are not to be changed lightly, and the enmity between your kinds was woven into the music of creation itself. It was the ultimate test of their new alliance. The Valor had spoken, and their word was law in Middle-earth. Would Scatha and the stone shepherds stand together against such authority? Or would ancient habit and the weight of divine displeasure drive them apart? The answer would determine not just their own fate, but the shape of all future ages. The wind that carried Manwe's voice also brought with it a presence that seemed to fill the very sky. Not malevolent, but implacable, like the face of a mountain carved in eternal stone. Above the gray mountains, the stars themselves seemed to dim as the Lord of the Valor made his displeasure known. Stonebeard felt the weight of that divine attention like a physical force, pressing down upon his shoulders with the accumulated authority of ages. Yet he did not bow his head or step back from Scatha's transformed form. Instead, he planted his feet more firmly upon the frozen ground and raised his voice in response. "Lord Manwe," he said, his words carrying the deep harmonics of mountain song, "we greet you as children should greet their elder, with respect, but not with submission. The patterns of the world are indeed ancient, but they are not immutable." The sky above them darkened further, and now other voices joined that of the Windlord of the Valar. Aule the smith spoke, his voice like the ringing of hammers on adamant. "My children, you were wrought to be guardians, not revolutionaries. The enmity between Stone Shepherd and Drake serves to maintain the balance between creation and destruction. But it was the voice of Varda Elantari that cut deepest, starlight made audible. "And what of justice, ancient ones? Scatha the cold Drake has wrought great evil in the world, has slain innocents beyond counting. Would you have him pardoned for all his crimes, simply because he now claims to seek redemption?" Scatha flinched at these words, his transformed form wavering like heat shimmer. For a moment, it seemed as though he might revert to his old nature, flee back into the familiar darkness of hatred and despair. But then Khazad-Uzbad stepped forward, placing one massive stone hand upon what might have been the dragon's shoulder. "Great Lady," the crown of stone said, his voice carrying the patience of millennia, "justice without mercy is mere vengeance, and vengeance serves no one save those who would see the world burn. We do not ask that Scatha's crimes be forgotten, only that his repentance be given the chance to bear fruit." The transformed dragon turned to look at the stone shepherd who had defended him, and in his crystalline eyes was an expression that no dragon had worn since the elder days. Gratitude mixed with wonder, as if he were seeing the possibility of goodness for the first time in ages. "You would stand beside me against the Valor themselves?" Scatha asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not against them," Stonebeard corrected. "With you before them. There is a difference, Ancient One. We do not seek to defy the will of the Valor, but to show them that their will itself might encompass more than they had originally planned." It was then that another voice joined the celestial chorus, one that none of them had expected to hear. Eru Ilúvatar himself spoke, not in word, but in the fundamental harmonies that underlie all creation, and his music carried both sorrow and joy, endings and beginning. The meaning of that divine song was unmistakable. The conflict between dragon and stone shepherd had indeed been part of the original design, but like all things in creation, it was subject to the great theme of redemption and renewal that ran through the heart of all existence. Even Melkor's discord, the music seemed to say, serves in the end to make the final harmony more beautiful. Manwe's voice, when it came again, carried a note of wonder that had not been there before. It may be that you have found a path that was hidden even from our sight. But if this alliance is to endure, it must be tested. Are you prepared to accept the trials that such testing would require?" Stonebeard and Khazad-Uzbad exchanged glances, each seeing in the other's eyes the same resolve. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. But it was Scatha who spoke first, his transformed voice carrying a strength that surprised even himself. "I have been tested by hatred for millennia, Great Ones, and found wanting. Let me now be tested by hope, and see if I might prove worthier of the gift of existence." The silence that followed this declaration seemed to stretch across all of Middle-earth. Then, slowly, the oppressive weight of divine attention began to lift, replaced by something that might almost have been approval. "So be it," came Allah's voice, rich with the satisfaction of a craftsman seeing an unexpected but pleasing development in his work. "But know this, the trials you face will not be of our making, but of the world. The other powers of Middle-earth will not easily accept this transformation, and there are those who have cause to hate both dragon and stone shepherd." "We understand," Stonebeard replied, "and we are ready." But even as he spoke, the stone shepherd felt a chill that had nothing to do with Skatha's transformed nature, for he could sense other minds turning their attention toward the Grey Mountain, minds filled with ancient grudges and newer fear. The Nazgul, stirring in their strongholds at the approach of something unprecedented, the mouth of Sauron, whispering poison in his master's ear about the danger of ancient enemies becoming allies, and perhaps most dangerous of all, those among the free peoples who would see in this alliance not hope, but betrayal. The trials Aulu had spoken of were already beginning, and the first test would come sooner than any of them expected. Far to the south, in the hidden fortress of Dol Guldur, a shadow deeper than night was stirring. The necromancer had returned to his ancient stronghold, and he was not pleased by the news his servants brought him. An alliance between Stone Shepherd and Cold Drake represented a dangerous precedent. If ancient enemies could become allies, what other alliances might form against the darkness? It was time, the necromancer decided, to remind the world why some enmities were meant to be eternal. In the depths of Dol Guldur, where the very stones wept tears of shadow, and the air itself seemed thick with malice, the necromancer brooded upon his throne of black iron. His form was hidden beneath robes that seemed to swallow light itself, but his eyes burned like red stars in the darkness of his hood. For nearly 1,000 years he had dwelt in this place, gathering his strength, weaving his plans, and now those plans were threatened by something he had never anticipated. "An alliance," he hissed, his voice like the sound of graves opening. "The Stone Shepherds and the Cold Drake, united in purpose. This cannot be permitted to endure." Before his throne knelt a figure that might once have been a man, though little remained of its original form. The lieutenant of Dol Guldur had served his master faithfully for centuries, and the rewards of that service had transformed him into something both more and less than mortal. "Master," the creature rasped, "our spies bring word that the alliance grows stronger. The transformed dragon has begun to teach the Stone Shepherds the deep lore of winter, while they share with him the songs of creation. Together, they reshape the very nature of the Grey Mountains." The necromancer's grip tightened upon the arms of his throne, and the black iron began to smoke beneath his touch. Then they must be separate. Ancient hatreds run deeper than new-forged friendships, and there are ways to remind them why their kinds were made to be eternal enemies. Rising from his throne, the Dark Lord moved to a great scrying glass that showed scenes from across Middle-earth. With a gesture of his will, the surface of the mirror rippled and cleared, revealing the transformed landscape of the Grey Mountain. Where once desolation had reigned, now there was a strange beauty. Ice gardens that sang in crystalline voices, frost trees whose branches held lights like captive stars, and in the center of it all, 3 figures working together to create wonders that the world had never seen. "Beautiful," the necromancer admitted, his voice dripping with contempt. "But beauty can be corrupted, and alliance can be turned to betrayal with the proper encouragement." From the shadows around his throne came other servants, creatures of malice and cunning who had served him in many dark enterprises. To each, he gave specific instructions, and as they departed on their various missions, a web of deceit and manipulation began to spread outward from Dol Guldur. Some went south to the kingdoms of men, carrying whispered lies about dragons who could not be trusted, and stone shepherds who had forgotten their duty to protect the innocent. Others flew north to the remaining strongholds of darkness, bearing promises of rich rewards for those who would help destroy this dangerous new alliance. But the most insidious of his servants went to places closer to the Grey Mountains themselves, to the halls of the dwarves beneath the earth, to the secret meeting places of those elves who remembered the dragon wars of old, to the councils of men who had cause to fear both stone and ice. "Let them hear tales of their ancient enemies," the necromancer whispered to the darkness. "Let them remember old wounds and nurse forgotten grudges, and when the time is right, let them march upon the Grey Mountains with fire and sword, convinced that they act in the cause of righteousness." Meanwhile, in the transformed peaks of the north, the three unlikely allies continued their work, unaware of the web being woven around them. Stonebeard and Khazad Uzbad taught Skatha the songs of stone and mountain, while the reformed dragon shared with them lore that was old when the world was young, knowledge of the deep paths beneath the earth, secrets of crystal and metal that even the dwarves had forgotten. "It is wondrous," Skatha said, as they paused in their labors, his voice now carrying harmonics of wind through ice caves and the distant music of growing crystals. "For so long I thought only of hoarding, of keeping knowledge and treasure locked away where none could share in their beauty. But this creating together, this building something greater than any of us could achieve alone. I had forgotten such joy was possible." Khazad Uzbad nodded, his crystalline eyes bright with satisfaction. "In the long years of my captivity, I dreamed of such cooperation. Dragon fire and stone song, ice wisdom and mountain strength, all working in harmony. We could reshape not just these peaks, the very relationship between the peoples of Middle-earth. Already the effects spread," added Stonebeard, gesturing toward the south, where the transformed energies of the Grey Mountains were beginning to influence the weather patterns of distant lands. "The harsh winters grow gentler, and the summers less scorching. The balance we create here brings harmony to realms we have never seen." But even as they spoke of harmony and balance, darker forces were at work. In the halls of Erebor, newly restored to the dwarf, King Dain Ironfoot listened to whispered reports of dragon activity in the north. The memories of Smaug's devastation were still fresh in the minds of his people, and the idea of another dragon, even a supposedly reformed one, awakening near their borders was cause for great alarm. "A dragon that claims to have changed its nature," Dain muttered, stroking his iron-gray beard. "And stone shepherd, who would ally with such a creature? Either they have been deceived, or they have forgotten their duty to protect the innocent from dragon fire." Similar councils were being held in other realms. In the halls of the Woodland King, Thranduil remembered the burning of the great forests in the dragon wars of old. In Rohan, Theoden's father heard tales of ice spreading southward and feared for his horse herd. And in Gondor, the ruling steward wondered if this new alliance represented a threat to the peace his people had fought so hard to achieve. The web was tightening, and soon the test that Olu had spoken of would come, not from the Valar themselves, but from the fears and prejudices of those who had suffered under dragon fire and winter's bite in ages past. In Dol Guldur, the necromancer smiled beneath his hood. Ancient hatreds were such useful tools, and pride. Pride could turn even the noblest hearts to darkness if it was properly nurtured. The first move in his great game had been made. Soon, the alliance between Stone Shepherd and Dragon would face its greatest test. Not the trial of enemies united against them, but something far more dangerous, the suspicion of those they sought to protect. As autumn turned toward winter across Middle-earth, the effects of the Great Alliance became impossible to ignore. The weather patterns that had held steady for millennia began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Winters grew less harsh in the southern land, while summers carried the promise of gentle rains rather than scorching drought. The very air seemed cleaner, charged with possibilities that made even the most pragmatic folk pause and wonder. But with wonder came fear, and with fear came the whisper that the necromancer's servant spread like poison through the halls of the mighty. In Dale, King Bard looked out from his palace walls toward the northern peaks. and saw lights dancing among the mountains, not the red glare of dragon fire, but something else entirely, like aurora trapped in crystalline formation. His advisors spoke in worried tones of the old prophecy, of the doom that comes when dragons wake, and though Bard himself was inclined toward hope rather than fear, the concerns of his people weighed heavily upon him. "My lord," said his chief counselor, a man whose family had fled the devastation of Lake Town, "the refugees who come down from the northern reaches speak strange tales. They say the very stones sing now in the Grey Mountains, and that the ice there has taken on forms both beautiful and terrible. Some claim to have seen shapes moving among the peaks, figures tall as towers, walking beside creatures of living frost." Bard nodded thoughtfully. "And what do these same refugees say of their treatment by these figures?" The counselor hesitated. "Well, they say they were helped, my lord, given shelter when storms arose, guided to safe paths when they became lost. But surely such kindness is merely a mask for some greater deception." It was a question that echoed in the halls of power across Middle-earth. How could ancient enemies become allies so suddenly? What trap might lie beneath such unprecedented cooperation? And most troubling of all, if dragons could change their nature, what other certainties might prove false? These doubts were carefully nurtured by the necromancer's agent, who spoke always in terms of prudence and protection. They did not openly call for war against the new alliance, but merely suggested that preparations should be made, that ancient defenses should be readied, that the wise course was to assume the worst, until proven otherwise. In the Grey Mountains themselves, the three allies continued their work, though they were not entirely unaware of the growing tension in the world around them. Guaihir and his eagles brought word of the armies gathering in distant lands, of the councils held in secret, of the fear that spread like wildfire through the realms of the free people. "They fear us," Skatha said, his transformed voice carrying a note of sadness that would have been impossible in his old form. "Perhaps they are right to do so. The hatred between our kinds runs deep, and trust is not easily built upon such foundation. Yet build it we must," replied Stonebeard firmly, "for if we abandon this alliance now, we prove their fears justified. Better to persist in hope and face whatever trials come." Khazad Uzbad, who had grown stronger with each passing day, now stood at his full height, a figure of such majesty that even the eagles paused in their flight to admire his form. "The question is not whether they will come," he said, his voice like distant thunder. "The question is what we shall do when they arrive." It was Skatha who provided the answer, his transformed nature bringing with it a wisdom that surprised even himself. "We shall welcome them," he said simply. "We shall open our halls to their envoys, show them what we have built, and let them see with their own eyes that change is possible." "And if they come not as envoys, but as conquerors?" asked Stonebeard. "Then we shall defend ourselves," replied the dragon, "but not as we might have in the old days. No fire shall we bring against them, no avalanche shall we send down upon their heads. We shall defend with patience, with demonstration, with the hope that understanding might yet triumph over fear." It was a bold strategy, perhaps even a foolish one, but as winter deepened and the lights in the Grey Mountains grew brighter, it became their only hope of proving that their alliance was genuine. The test came sooner than expected. On the first day of the new year, as the sun rose pale and cold over the snow-covered peaks, a great host appeared in the southern passage. Not one army, but many. Dwarves from Erebor marching under the banner of the Lonely Mountain, men from Dale and Rohan carrying weapons forged for dragon slaying, elves from the woodland realm with arrows that could pierce even the hardest scales. At their head rode figures of great renown, King Dain Ironfoot of the dwarves, his armor gleaming with protective rune, Thranduil of the woodland realm, his face set in the implacable mask he wore when preparing for war, and surprisingly, Aragorn himself, the returned king of Gondor, his hand resting on the hilt of Anduril as he surveyed the transformed landscape before them. "So," Aragorn said quietly, his voice carrying to his companions on the wind, "The tales are true. The gray mountains are changed indeed." Before them stretched not the desolation they had expected, but something that defied easy description. The peaks themselves seemed to glow with inner light, their snow-covered slopes adorned with formations of ice that caught and reflected the sunlight in patterns of impossible beauty. Gardens of crystal bloomed in places where nothing should have been able to grow, and the very air shimmered with harmonies that touched the heart even as they puzzled the mind. "Beautiful," admitted Thranduil grudgingly, "but beauty can hide great evil, as we learned in the days of the Dragon Wars." Dain spat into the snow. "Aye, and dragons are creatures of deception above all else. Mark me, this is all glamour and illusion, meant to lull us into complacency before the trap is sprung." But Aragorn said nothing, his keen eyes studying the approaches to the mountains with the gaze of one trained in the lore of many lands. What he saw troubled him, but not in the way his companion expected. For there were no fortifications here, no hidden ambushes, no sign of preparation for war. Instead, the paths that led up into the peaks were clear and welcoming, marked with stones that glowed softly in the winter air, not with menace, but with guidance. "They know we are here," he said at last, "and they welcome us." It was then that the first test of the Great Alliance truly began. For approaching through the snow came three figures that caused even the bravest warriors to grip their weapons tighter. Two stone shepherds of enormous size and majesty, and between them a being that was clearly dragonborn, yet unlike any dragon in all the tales and songs of Middle-earth. The final confrontation was at hand, and upon its outcome would hang the fate of the alliance that might reshape the very nature of good and evil in the world. The great host stood in silence as the three figures approached, their footsteps leaving prints in the snow that glowed with soft phosphorescence before fading back to ordinary white. Each warrior present had heard tales of stone shepherds and dragons, but none had ever seen them walking together in apparent harmony, and the sight struck them with wonder that warred against ancient fear. Stonebeard walked in the center, his massive form radiating the calm patience of mountain, while Khazad-Uzbad flanked him on the left, the crown of stone living up to his name, with a bearing that spoke of kingship older than any mortal realm. But it was Skatha who drew the most attention, for his transformation was so complete that many initially doubted he was truly a dragon at all. Gone was the serpentine malice, the cold drake of legend. In its place walked a being of winter made beautiful, tall as the stone shepherd, but more graceful, his form suggesting both the crystalline structure of ice and the flowing movement of wind over snow. His eyes, once burning with cold fire, now held depths that reflected the aurora, and when he moved, it was with the deliberate grace of falling snow rather than the predatory stalking of a hunting beast. "I am Khazad Gash, called Stonebeard," the central figure announced, his voice carrying clearly across the snowy plain. "These are my companions, Khazad-Uzbad, the crown of stone, and Skatha, who was once called the Cold, but now bears a new name in the tongues of the wise." Aragorn stepped forward from the ranks of the Alliance, his hand still resting on Anduril's hilt, but his posture more curious than threatening. "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, king of Gondor and Arnor. I come with allies from many lands, drawn by reports of unusual happenings in these mountains." Unusual. Skatha's voice, when he spoke, was like wind chimes made of ice, beautiful and strange. An interesting choice of words, King of Men. We prefer to think of them as hopeful. Dain Ironfoot could contain himself no longer. The dwarf king stepped forward, his hand on his warhammer, and pointed accusingly at the transformed dragon. "Hopeful? You speak of hope? Worm? My people remember Smaug, remember the burning of Dale, and the desolation of Erebor. What hope have dragons ever brought, save the hope of death?" Coo. The words hung in the cold air like a challenge, and for a moment it seemed as though the ancient patterns might reassert themselves. Dragon rage meeting dwarvish stubbornness, with stone and steel as the inevitable result. But Skatha's response surprised everyone present. "You are right to remember Smaug," he said, his voice heavy with what could only be described as sorrow. "He was my cousin in the far reaches of dragonkind, and his deeds brought shame upon all our lineage. I cannot undo the evils he wrought, king under the mountain, any more than you can undo the greed that first drew dwarves to delve too deep in Khazad-dûm. But I can choose to be something different than what I was." Thranduil stepped forward then, his ageless face stern as winter itself. "Pretty words, dragon, but words are wind, and we have heard such promises before from your kind. How do we know this is not some elaborate deception?" It was Khazad-Uzbad who answered, his voice like the deep echo of stone chambers. "Because, Lord of the woodland realm, we have spent months in his company, and we have seen his heart. The Skatha who stands before you is not the cold drake of old. That being died in the transformation as surely as a caterpillar dies when it becomes a butterfly." "And what of the future?" demanded one of the Rohirrim captains. "How do we know this transformation will endure? What happens when dragon nature reasserts itself?" Skatha was quiet for a long moment, his aurora-colored eyes distant with thought. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute honesty. "I do not know," he admitted. "The path I have chosen is new, not just to me but to all of dragonkind. I may fail, I may fall back into old patterns of thought and deed, but if I do not try, if I choose the safety of certain evil over the risk of possible good, then I am no different than I was before." Aragorn studied the transformed dragon with the keen eye of one who had faced great evil and recognized great good when he saw it. "You ask us to trust you based on potential rather than proof. That is a significant request. Not just to trust him," Stonebeard interjected, "but to trust the idea that change is possible, that ancient enmities need not endure forever, that cooperation might achieve what conflict never could." He gestured toward the transformed landscape around them. "Look upon what we have wrought together in these few months. The harsh winters that have plagued your lands for generations grow gentler. The storms that brought floods and droughts begin to moderate. The very air grows cleaner as we learn to balance fire and ice, creation and preservation." Thranduil's expression softened slightly as he considered these words. The Elven King had indeed noticed the changes in weather pattern, the way the seasons seemed more balanced than they had been in centuries. "These changes, they stem from your alliance? From our understanding," Khazad-Uzbad corrected. "When ancient enemies learn to work together, when opposing forces find harmony rather than endless conflict, the very world responds. We are connected to the deep structures of creation, Lord Thranduil. Our harmony brings harmony to all things." It was then that the great choice was laid before the assembled host. They could choose to see in this alliance a threat to be destroyed, in which case they would likely succeed. For all their power, the three allies could not stand against the combined might of the free people, or they could choose to see it as an opportunity, a chance to heal wounds that had festered since the world's youth. Dain was the first to speak. The Dwarf King studied Skatha for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, set down his war hammer. "Dragon," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "if you would have the trust of the dwarves, then prove it not with words, but with deeds. The Lonely Mountain has chambers that have lain empty since Smaug's time, poisoned by dragon fire and toxic with old malice. If you are truly changed, heal them." Skatha inclined his head in acknowledgement. "It shall be done, King under the mountain. The poison of my cousin's fire shall be drawn out and replaced with the clean cold of winter's rest." Thranduil was next. "The woodland realm remembers the burning of the great forest. If you would have our trust, dragon, then help the burned places bloom again. Let ice and snow nurture new growth where fire once destroyed. This too shall be done," Skatha replied. Finally, Aragorn stepped forward. The King of Gondor looked into the transformed dragon's eyes and saw there something that decided him. "If you are truly changed, if this alliance is genuine, then prove it by the greatest test of all. Come south with us. Meet with the common folk, the farmers and merchants and craftsmen who have the most to fear from dragons. Let them see you as you are now, and win their trust, not through fear, but through service. It was the ultimate challenge to abandon the safety of the remote mountains and walk among those who had the most reason to hate and fear dragonkind. For a moment, Skatha hesitated, and in that hesitation, all present could see the magnitude of what was being asked. Then the transformed dragon smiled, an expression no dragon had ever worn in all the history of Middle-earth. "Yes," he said simply, "yes, I will come. For if this change is to have meaning, it must be tested, not in the heights where few venture, but in the valleys where all life dwells." And so it was decided. The great alliance would be tested not through battle, but through service, not through the grand gestures of war, but through the quiet work of healing and renewal. It was a choice that would echo through all the ages to come, a moment when ancient hatred gave way to unprecedented hope. As the combined host prepared to march south, carrying with them three unlikely companions, the very stars seemed to shine brighter in the winter sky, for something new had been born in Middle-earth. Not just an alliance between former enemies, but the idea that no one, no matter how far they had fallen into darkness, was beyond the reach of redemption. The last of the stone giants had awakened indeed, but more than that, they had awakened to a world where even the coldest hearts could learn to love, and where the greatest strength was not the power to destroy, but the courage to forgive. And in the halls of Dol Guldur, the necromancer felt his plans crumble to ash, for he had reckoned without the one force that could overcome all his malice, the simple, revolutionary idea that everyone deserves a second chance. The last of the stone giants had become the first of something entirely new, and Middle-earth would never be the same.